right, we are live. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to another live coaching call with Nido Marketing. Today we have special guest, Dr. Katie Brown from the National Center for Montessori in the Public Sector. Hello, Katie. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So we invited Katie to this call because we wanted to talk about ways that we can really measure what matters, which is what, of course, her slide is showing here. So as Montessorians, we know it's really challenging to capture the really important pieces we know exist in our environments. And the National Center for Montessori in Public Sector has created this amazing tool that Katie's going to tell you all about, so I won't do too much. But it is so helpful for Montessori schools to be able to articulate what it is that we do and measure it with data, because we know we struggle sometimes to actually have the data behind what we know to be true. So without further ado, Dr. Katie, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks so much. So just to get us started here, I want to tell you all a little bit about the National Center for Montessori in the Public Sector, in case you're not familiar with who we are and what we do. We are the only national nonprofit organization devoted exclusively to serving, I shouldn't say exclusively because we do work with a number of independent schools as well, but devoted specifically to serving the 500 plus public Montessori schools in the United States. So our mission is to help families access high quality personalized education through Montessori programs in public schools. So if you have ever visited the Montessori Census website, which is a map and listing of all the known Montessori programs in the US, or Teach Montessori, which is a website where schools can list their teacher openings and teachers can post their resumes, a job site for Montessori schools, basically. If you've ever visited either of those websites, those are initiatives of ours. We also just put out a book called the Montessori Assessment Playbook, which is a compendium of a lot of our tools, which you may have seen floating around in the Montessori universe. And lastly, what I'm here to talk about today is a tool we've developed called the Developmental Environmental Rating Scale, or the DERS. So the DERS is a tool that we developed to solve for a problem that many of the public Montessori schools that we work with were having with measuring classroom quality in a way that made sense for external stakeholders and for external accountability frameworks. So to explain a little bit about the origin of the DERS and how it came to be, I want us to zoom out just a little bit first and think about where Montessori fits in terms of existing models of schooling. This graphic that I'm about to show you is borrowed from Steve Hughes. So if you've ever heard him talk about Montessori's place in education reform, you may have seen this framework before. So as we think about different models of schooling, we can think about them on two different continuums. The first continuum that you see on the y-axis there is the amount of structure that is provided within the classroom setting. Some programs are low structure, some programs are high structure. On the x-axis there, we have the degree to which the program is teacher-centered versus student-centered. We often hear this talked about as the sage on the stage versus the guide on the side, right, in terms of the role of the teacher. So if we think about our sort of conventional schools, this is traditional school, kind of the way school's been done in the United States for the last 100 years. Most of us as children probably attended conventional schools, where we think of the desks in the rows and the teacher at the front of the room, right? And within this framework, that conventional environment falls on the high structure side, right? Those classrooms tended to be fairly rigid, fairly prescribed. Everyone's doing the same thing at the same time. And also highly teacher-centered. So those conventional schools occupy this upper left quadrant of this graph here. At the other end of both of those axes, we have the total opposite, right? We have something like the free schools. This was a movement that gained some momentum in the 1960s. The Summerhill School in England is probably the most famous example of this model. There aren't a whole lot of them in the United States, although actually I've recently learned that there is one in Maryland here, just outside Washington, D.C., where I live. So there are a few of them. But this is the opposite end of the pole in terms of The structure being very, very loose, that there's not a whole lot of prescribed schedule or rhyme or reason to the activities, and that it is the ultimate in student-centered education, that the teacher is really just there to be a resource for the children as they go about setting the structure of their day. When we think about the other quadrants of this graphic, if we were to combine an environment that is low in structure but still teacher-centered, we might find something like a project-based learning school, wherein the structure is loose and flexible and sort of adaptable to the project at hand, but it's still very teacher-centered, where the teacher is facilitating that project for children. And then lastly, Montessori occupies this fourth space in this graphic that we call developmental education. So in developmental schools, the structure, there's actually a very high level of structure, although it is covert. As I'm sure many of you know, this is one of the most common misunderstandings about Montessori. Many people think that Montessori schools are places that completely lack in structure, and we of course know that that's not true. The environments are highly, highly structured. But at the same time, the environments are highly student-centered. Montessori environments are environments where the teacher is serving as a guide, and the children are really driving the action and driving their own learning.
This is really good, a great visual to see, because I think when sometimes we get so into our worlds, to be able to remember that the different structures look like this, right? It's such a simple concept to grasp and one to always remember.
Yeah, I found this to be a really helpful way for thinking about what Montessori is and how it's different from a lot of the other things that are out there. So one of the challenges that many of the schools we were working with were experiencing was that for accountability purposes, many of them were required to use environmental rating scales or observation rubrics that were predicated on a conventional understanding of what school is and what school should look like. Many of these are environmental rating scales. Many of your community members here might be familiar with the ECHRS, the Early Childhood Environment Rating Scale, which looks at all of those things that are listed, bulleted there on the slide. Another one that some of our public schools are required to use is called the CLASS, which, I forget what that acronym stands for, but this is an observational rubric that evaluates the learning environment on the basis of these three categories: emotional support, classroom organization, and instructional support. And the problem with this is that these tools are essentially a round peg that are being put in that square hole of Montessori, right? These are evaluation tools that are predicated on assumptions about what learning looks like that are not actually the assumptions that we're working from in our developmental learning environments. With the CLASS in particular, that instructional support area is one where Montessori environments tend to do rather poorly because the CLASS is assuming that a lot of teacher chatter is a good thing in terms of supporting children's language development, whereas in our Montessori environments, we don't see a whole lot of adults talking at children and chattering away at them, right? Language use is quiet, language use is natural, it tends to happen a lot in one-on-one, and it's very intentional. So the schools that we work with were struggling because on these types of evaluations, they didn't look so good, even though they knew that what was happening in their learning environments was really high quality and really good for children. So if we dig below the surface a little bit, again, these tools are assuming that learning is something that happens in the interaction between teachers and students. And so many of them are predicated on looking at these dyadic interactions between teachers and students, where teachers are giving direction, giving feedback, and monitoring children. Of course, we know as Montessorians and constructivists that learning is something that is a social endeavor and that it is something that happens in relationship with others and in interactions with others. But our understanding of how learning happens in a Montessori environment is more complex than this. this is how we imagine learning happening in a Montessori environment, right? This is what we call the Montessori triad. It's what other thinkers outside of Montessori have described as the developmental core. This idea that learning is actually a three-way interaction between the child, the adult, and the environment, where the adult is interacting with the child, but the adult is also preparing the environment for the child to have learning through experimental interactions with that environment. So all of that is to say that we developed the DERS as a way to help Montessori schools actually measure what matters for children's development in terms of the quality of their learning environments. So we at the National Center really like to encourage schools when they're thinking about quality and continuous improvement to think about aligning inputs at both the school and classroom level with outcomes for children. And we like to talk about improved wide scope outcomes when we talk about outcomes for children. So I want to spend just a minute explaining what we mean by that. So historically, the outcomes that count have been a little bit different from the outcomes that matter. So when we talk about the outcomes that count, and again, I'm speaking mostly from a public school frame of reference here, these are the things that tend to get factored into a school's state report card or their performance management framework. The terminology for these kinds of things varies from place to place, depending whether we're talking about district schools or charter schools, but they all tend to look at the same sorts of numbers. These numbers include performance on standardized tests, and typically that's a very narrow band of standardized tests that look only at reading and math and sometimes science. Maybe 2 or 3 times over the course of a child's career, they'll take a standardized science test that's actually a part of the school's accountability framework. Attendance and retention, and school matriculation after Montessori. Where do they go when they leave the school? Now, that's not to say that these outcomes aren't important. Certainly we know that coming to school is important, and that being able to retain families is a signal that something that we're doing is working for them. But the research that we have suggests that if this is all that we're going off of to look at children's development, then we're really missing big pieces of the picture. A lot of the preeminent thinkers in child development and in education today are really encouraging us to broaden our thinking about what kinds of outcomes actually matter for children's long-term life trajectories and ultimately for human flourishing. Susan Engel is one of these thinkers. She has a book out called The End of the Rainbow, which if you've not had a chance to look at it, I highly recommend you check it out. She argues that schools should really be trying to prepare children to have happy and fulfilling lives rather than just, churning out children with high SAT scores. And she argues that the skills that we really need to be instilling in children for them to be happy and successful contributing members of society are things like conversation and communication, the ability to engage deeply with material and maintain focus on something for extended period of time, the ability to think critically and to be flexible in their thinking and to make arguments that are based on evidence. These are more complex outcomes. These are outcomes that are not well captured by those end of year reading and math tests, right? Another one of these thinkers is Ellen Galinsky. She has a similar argument basically in terms of thinking about the kinds of skills that we should be instilling in children in order for them to be successful adults. This list looks very similar, right? We also see communication. We also see critical thinking. We also see the ability to focus. We hear a similar message from Kathy Hirsch-Pasek and Roberta Golinkoff. Becoming Brilliant is their recent book. Again, all of these books are great reading if you're interested in thinking about what outcomes actually matter for children going into adulthood in the 21st century. So all of these, oh, sorry, go ahead, Denise.
No, Katie, I want to appreciate you for sending those resources our way, because again, from a marketing standpoint, we have these conversations often with parents, and often parents of 3-year-olds, where they're curious to know what they're going to get. We talk about a 3-year program, and we, aside from talking about what we do and how we do it, we want to talk about the outcomes. And this is really good information to build from when we do talk about those outcomes that truly matter, especially with new literature and especially with people that are not Montessorians. Because I think, the more that we can bring to the table in the collaboration in the education space, that people can start looking towards Montessori and realizing, wow, this is actually something that we are discovering as incredibly important. And we can say, hey, by the way, we've been around for 100 years plus. It's just really, really great to send those resources and look into them and have them, on your shelf, and give parents who are not so familiar with Montessori another option to see that actually speaks the same language.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And none of those authors are Montessori people. Those are all people coming from mainstream education scholarship and child development scholarship. And those are great resources to, if you do like parent book clubs or recommended reading for parents, those are great resources to share.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that.
There's really increasing consensus in the fields of education and psychology that executive functions are really key for, again, these long-term, wide-scope outcomes in terms of children's success and happiness. So executive functions is sort of an umbrella term that psychologists sometimes the metaphor they use is that your executive functions are the air traffic controller of your brain. They include the capacity to consciously direct your attention, to inhibit impulses, and to consciously shift your thinking, to be flexible in the way that you're thinking about something. So they manifest in the classroom as the ability to concentrate on something for an extended period of time, the ability to resist impulses and resist distraction, to persist in the face of difficulty, to plan, work thoughtfully, and to be flexible, to be able to adapt to changing circumstances. These are really, really key capacities that are developing rapidly in early childhood. So for those of you who work with, primary age children, this is really the prime time for those children to be developing these skills that are predictive of all kinds of outcomes throughout their life, both academic and non-academic. Even things like marital satisfaction have been shown to be predicted by executive functions. So these are a really, really key capacity to be developing for children. And the literature tells us that this is one thing that Montessori does really well. So that's another important thing to be communicating to parents. The reason that we do things the way that we do in our classrooms is because this is what we're going for.
Mm-hmm. How powerful. The big one.
So to that end, if that's what we're going for, we need to be mapping backward from those desired outcomes to figure out what the learning environments should look like to promote the development of those skills for children. So that's exactly what we did with the DERS. We said, okay, what does the literature tell us about what actually matters for children's outcomes throughout their life, for human flourishing? And three things became abundantly clear. One, executive functions, which are the first three domains that are listed there: initiation and concentration, inhibition, and working memory. Those all fall under the umbrella of executive functions. We also know that linguistic and cultural fluency is really, really important for children. This loosely translates as literacy, but it's broader than that. It's also about understanding how to use language in a cultural context, right? Language and culture are inseparable. They are intertwined. And we can't just think about literacy as decoding and comprehension. We really have to think about it as that broader idea of communication that Kathy Hirsch-Pasek and Susan Engel and all those writers discuss. And then lastly, we know that it's really important for children to develop social emotional skills. We phrase this as social fluency and emotional flexibility, the ability to navigate social relationships and the ability to self-regulate emotions and recover from disappointment. So knowing that these are the 5 things we want children to get out of their time in learning environments, we mapped backwards to figure out at the classroom level, what does the environment need to look like in order to make that happen for children? So the DERS is divided up into 5 domains. These are those 5 domains that I just named for you. The first 3 in orange, again, are all just aspects of executive function, while that 4th one is about literacy and that 5th one is about social and emotional skills. So thinking about what this actually looks like if you walk into a Montessori classroom and you're looking to see children demonstrating executive function. That means paying attention to what they're doing. That means screening out distraction. Montessori classrooms are busy places, right? All the kids are doing different things. And so there's a lot going on. There's a lot of potential distractions. And being in that environment gives children the opportunity to practice that key skill of being able to focus on what they're doing and what's in front of them, and resisting the impulse to look at what everyone else is doing around them. Although certainly peer observation is a part of the equation there as well. Working memory, I haven't talked about too much to date, but it's really, really important for cognition and learning. Working memory is the capacity to hold information in your mind while you're working with it. So if you've ever gone to the grocery list without gone to the grocery store without a written list, you just have a mental list of the like 5 things that you need to bake your child's birthday cake. And you're walking up and down the aisles and you're checking things off the list as you pull them off the shelf. That's you using your working memory. Working memory is really important because the way that we incorporate new information is always by relating it to what we already know. So we have to be able to hold new information in our mind in order to make those connections, to make that learning part of our long-term memory. So linguistic and cultural fluency, again, has to do with understanding not just spoken and written language, but also the cultural attitudes and expectations that are communicated as part of those spoken and written words. And then that social fluency and emotional flexibility piece, again, has to do with navigating social interactions and self-regulating emotions. And I think anyone who has spent time in a primary environment lately knows that that is a big part of the work of the first plane. Okay. So when we think about these capacities, one thing that we know to be true is that they are highly overlapping and interrelated. So we know that executive functions are related to social and emotional development in a way that, although they are different capacities, they are interrelated, and the development of one impacts the development of another. So for example, I mentioned that with executive functions, one of the capacities involved is the ability to change the way you're thinking about something. Well, that is the capacity that you use to take a different perspective and to see something from a different point of view. To do that also requires you to draw on social intelligence and emotional intelligence, right? To understand the way that a different person might see something. So what this diagram shows is this is showing the ways in which these 3 areas of outcomes are interrelated. And in the middle, we see things that are common to all 3 of them. So when we're looking for places where children are developing these things, these places will be marked by children who are joyful, children who are using their reason to navigate their learning, children who are curious and creative, and children who have lots and lots of opportunities to communicate with others. I'm going to move a little more quickly through these slides here. Okay. So when we designed the DERS, we thought about, okay, so these are the 5 outcomes that we want children to have. So if children are developing these skills, then these are the things we want to be seeing those children doing, right? If they are developing inhibitory control, then they need to have opportunities to exercise patience. They need to have opportunities within their environment to wait, right? If the environment is characterized by instant gratification, they're not getting the opportunity to develop that skill. Similarly, they need the opportunity to correct their own work. If they are always dependent on an adult for feedback as to whether they're correct or not, that makes it difficult for them to develop these capacities. So that second outer light blue ring that you see here, these are the child behaviors that we're looking for that indicate that children are having opportunities to practice and develop these skills. If we zoom out one step further, this green ring indicates what adults need to be doing and what the environment needs to be providing in order to support these child behaviors. So for example, to develop that social fluency and emotional flexibility, classrooms need to be set up with mixed age grouping to allow for some of those heterogeneous social interactions to happen. If we want children to be developing their linguistic and cultural fluency, then they need to have choice and flexibility in the environment to be moving around and having those interactions and those conversations. So this is a graphic that just represents how the DERS was built from the outside, or from the inside out, starting with those child outcomes and mapping all the way out to what the adults are doing and what characterizes the learning environment. So we've talked about the wide scope outcomes that we're looking for. The DERS is a measure of classroom level high fidelity practice. So it is not the Montessori police. It is not a measure that was derived from, the writings of Maria Montessori, or, what any one teacher training program says teachers should be doing. Rather, it's derived from the literature on these outcomes for children. It's derived from education and child development and psychological literature about what child behaviors are characteristic of these environments, what adult behaviors are characteristics of these environments, and then how the physical environment itself is structured for children. So the idea is that we're encouraging folks to look at both of these things together. We encourage schools to look at what's going on in the classroom and what's going on for children, so that you can see how those two things are related. This is just another representation of that Montessori triangle. So the DERS is a 60-minute classroom observation tool. There are 60 different items divided up into child behaviors, adult behaviors, and aspects of the learning environment. It's an iPad-based app. And what we wanted to do with this app is we wanted to take Montessori out of the black box. So much of what goes on in a Montessori classroom can seem like a mystery to folks who are not Montessori trained, right? Montessori has its own language, its own jargon. There's these specific materials, and if you haven't been trained, you don't know what they're for. It's very difficult to walk into a Montessori classroom and really understand what's happening. So what we wanted to do with this was we wanted to provide a lens that a person who may or may not be Montessori trained could use to take into a classroom and understand what they should be looking for as evidence of a high quality learning environment. Now, again, this is not a measure of Montessori fidelity per se, but as it turns out, Maria Montessori was onto something, right? This wonderful curriculum and pedagogy that she developed is completely consistent with what the literature tells us about what schools should be doing to foster these outcomes for children. So even though the DERS does not contain an inventory of all the Montessori materials that should be in your primary classroom, it can be a very good way for you to document what's going on in those classrooms, identify strengths, identify opportunities for growth, and then have those as a way to communicate with your parents about what their children are getting out of their time in your environments. So it is differentiated for primary environments and elementary environments. Some of the items are the same across the two ages. Obviously, both primary environments and elementary environments should be multi-age, for example, but some of the items are different just based on the developmental needs of children in the first plane versus children in the second plane. We have an adolescent version of the tool that's currently in development, with plans for an infant toddler version later down the road as well, but currently it is available for primary and elementary. So this is just a sampling of some of the child behaviors, adult behaviors, and aspects of the environment that we're looking for at that primary level. So for the child, we have a couple of items that look for evidence of sustained attention, right? That children are able to initiate work and maintain engagement with it for an extended period of time. We are looking for evidence of independence, that they can, choose their own work, and that they can care for the environment and care for themselves without adult intervention. With the adult behaviors, we're really looking for restraint. That's one of the primary characteristics of the adult in the Montessori environment, right? That the adult is promoting independence by providing as little help as possible, but as much as needed, right? We're looking for invitation and choice, facilitating that choice for children by inviting them to participate in things rather than commanding them. We're looking for a sense of wonder also. We're looking for adults to inspire children to be curious and to seek out their own answers. And then just to give you a sampling of some of the environment items, this includes sort of the physical nature of the classroom, like is the classroom orderly? Is there a lot of visual clutter? Is the furniture made out of natural materials? Is there a lot of like plastic in the room? But it also includes things like how long is the uninterrupted work period? What are the ages of the classroom, of the children in the classroom? Do the children have access to the outdoors within their learning environment? When we look at the DERS for second plane children in elementary environments, we see many of the same items, but again, a few of those items are different just based on what we know about the differences in what second plane children are learning and doing and what they need. So with elementary children, we would want to see a lot more evidence of collaboration, knowing the social nature of the second plane child. We would want to see the adults engaging in more storytelling and maybe a little more challenge, inviting children to try more difficult things. And for the most part, the aspects of the learning environment are pretty much similar. And again, the adolescent DERS is still in development, but some of the items that would be different for this plane of development would be, we would want to see evident are to exercising their cognitive flexibility by situations that require them to think of, like, to tolerate ambiguity, to consider things that are not just cut and dried. In terms of their relationship with the adult, we know that a sense of trust between adolescents and adults is really, really key at this age. So we have items in that adult behavior section that get at that. And then lastly, one thing we know about adolescents is that they need opportunities to participate in meaningful real work. So the learning environment for that age really needs to facilitate that. Okay. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to take a few minutes to actually show you guys the DERS app. Now that we've spent all that time going through sort of the theory and the research foundations and the philosophical foundations, I want to show you what this actually looks like so you can get some ideas about what this might contribute to your learning environment and how this might help you in terms of your communications with parents and community members and stakeholders. So as I mentioned, it is an iPad-based app, and when you first log in, the screen looks like this. So you select your school from the drop-down menu, and you can type in the name of the classroom where you're observing. From that bottom drop-down menu, you have the opportunity to choose early childhood or elementary. One feature of the DERS that's really pretty neat is it's also available in a self-study version. So this was, again, primarily designed for situations where you have an administrator or some kind of external evaluator who is not Montessori trained, who's going into an environment to observe. And we want to help them be able to document all the great stuff that's happening in that classroom. But what we also found in the process of developing and implementing this tool is that it's really powerful as a tool for observing your own environment as well for teachers. So the self-study versions for both early childhood and elementary give you the opportunity to observe just the child behaviors and the environment items for a given room. The assumption is that if you're observing in your own classroom, you're not going to be seeing any of the usual adult behaviors because you're the adult in your classroom, right? So the adult items are removed from the self-study versions. So that is an option in there for you. A lot of the schools we work with also use this as a peer observation tool. So when you start the observation, it takes you to the observation screen. It's designed as a 60-minute observation window, so there is a countdown timer going in the upper right-hand corner there. The screen is divided into child behaviors, adult behaviors, and aspects of the learning environment. There are 20 items on each of these screens. And so what happens is when you observe something that you want to document, you would tap on that item. For example, joy is one of the child behaviors that I mentioned earlier. This tool is really great because that's something that's really not captured in a lot of our other assessments of learning environments or classroom quality, but it's really important, right? It's really important that children be happy and joyful in the environment if they're going to be learning and developing optimally. So when you're ready to document the joy that you see in the classroom, you tap the item, and then the bullet points are the look-fors. So yes, the item is joy, but what does that mean? When we say we're looking for joy, what specifically are we looking for? Well, we're looking for children who are smiling or laughing or singing. We're looking to see that children seem at ease in the environment, that they're comfortable. We're looking for children who seem satisfied with their work, who seem gratified by what they're doing, and children who are peaceful. Along the bottom of the screen is the scoring guide. So this tells you, based on those look-fors, how you should score this particular environment for joy. So most of the adult and child behaviors are on a scale of 0 to 3. Most of the environment items are on a scale of 0 to 2. Environment items tend to just be a little bit less ambiguous. It's kind of like either they're there or they're not. But with the child and adult behaviors, there's more room for nuance. So a 0 would be if you do not see any children in the room who seem joyful. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you would give it a 3 if it seems like almost all of the children in the room are joyful. So you can toggle freely between the child behaviors and the adult behaviors and the aspects of the learning environment. When you have scored an item, the circle changes color to indicate that that item has been scored. So the darker green is a higher score and the orange is a lower score. So it goes orange, yellow, green. I do want to emphasize that some of these items are actually negatively scored. So for example, disrupting is an item, a child behavior that you see here on this screen. With these items, it's really not a matter of how do I judge this classroom? It's a question of how much of this behavior am I seeing? And the scoring guide directs you to score it in that way. So for disrupting, a 0 would mean I didn't see any disruption, and a 3 would be this is a classroom culture that's really characterized by pervasive disruption. So it's not so much that the goal is to get a 3 on every single item. The goal is really just to be a neutral observer and document what you see. And sometimes what we see requires a little more explanation, right? Sometimes you see something really remarkable that you want to capture. And so there's a note feature. So once an item has been scored, you'll see this little like text bubble that appears next to the item. And if you tap that text bubble, you can actually make a note. So for example, I was watching a video that was shot in a classroom the other day, and there's 2 little girls who are sitting at the snack table and they're having their snack together and they're talking, they're having a conversation. And then in the middle of their conversation, they lifted up their little milk glasses and did a little cheers, which was so cute, but also like social graces at work, right? And grace and courtesy. And so that would be the kind of thing that I might want to make a note about, this like remarkable thing that I saw in this observation. So you have the opportunity to do that here. At the end of your observation, the app generates a report that is both quantitative and qualitative. So you've just spent an hour scoring all 60 of these items with numbers, right? So of course it makes sense that at the end of that process, you're going to have some numbers that come out of it, right? So it yields a score in each of those 5 domains on a scale of 0 to 100. And we've developed benchmarks to sort of indicate rough categories of where the score for each one would fall. So for example, initiation and concentration is domain 1. For this particular classroom that I observed, the score was a 72 out of 100 for that domain. If we look at the categories here in this bar graph, we see that a 72 falls within the high functioning category. The app automatically generates this narrative that describes, based on how the individual items were scored, what was going on in the classroom with relation to those items that were associated with initiation and concentration. So for example, one of the adult behaviors in the app is observation, right? Are the adults sitting and observing and taking notes? So there's a sentence here in this report. It's the third sentence, I think. Adults were seen sitting in an observer's chair taking notes. So that's a sentence that was automatically generated based on the way I scored that item. This is designed to be a starting point for the narrative portion of the report. Obviously, no pre-generated text is going to perfectly capture what you saw. So you have the option to fully edit that paragraph. It's just a place that you can start from. And then any notes that you took during the course of the observation are also included in the notes section. And so there is a bar graph and narrative like this for each of the 5 domains in the report. The next part of the report is a rated attributes table that actually shows how each item was scored. And as I mentioned, some of these items are negatively scored, and those items are flagged with that red asterisk, which is important to know because in terms of thinking about what this means for continuous improvement, you don't want to just look at all the things that scored a 0 and say, okay, we need to do more of that. Right? Because calling across the room is not something we want to be doing more of, right? Having a 0 and calling across the room is actually a great thing. So the rated attributes table allows you to see how each individual item was scored. And this might be an opportunity for you to really highlight some of the strengths of a particular classroom or of your program writ large. You know, if you had DERS data from all of your classrooms, you might be able to say like, wow, our children are really joyful. That's something that's really special about our program. Or our guides are really, really great about exercising friendliness with error. They really allow kids to make their own mistakes. And that's important because that's how children develop executive function, right? So this is really a rich source of information.
It is. I imagine too, Katie, it would be helpful in a conversation with parents, both at the beginning of the year and throughout their journey at your school, to give them the language that isn't necessarily Montessori specific, but absolutely what our environments do and the language that parents can connect with immediately. You know, if your guides are offering options, you can talk about what that looks like. If they're, you know, if the child is working through a precise way of doing something, you can talk about that. And it's just what I love about this whole tool is that not only is it a tool for you to use with your staff, but a way to help us formulate a narrative that makes sense for our parents, because ultimately that's who needs to know what we're doing, you know, because we know and we can keep this internal, but it's such a good way to bridge that gap with our parents.
That's exactly right. Yeah, even something as simple as activities requiring turn taking. You know, parents might assume that you only have one pink tower because you have a limited budget, right? But actually, we only have one pink tower because we want children to have to wait, right? We're building into the environment opportunities to take turns and wait. So exactly, giving them the language for that can really help them understand what it is that they're seeing.
Yeah, you know, and I was also thinking as you said that, it gives them an opportunity to start with a foundation and then make their own connections, right? So if they knew that we really work together as a school to, you know, make sure that children have opportunities to take turns, then they may look at the environment and answer that question themselves. Oh, they only have one pink tower because of this. I already know that that's something that this school does. And those connections, I mean, it's almost like what we do with the children. They make those connections, and we can really help parents do that too.
Right. And, you know, Montessori doesn't have a monopoly on any of these things. These adult behaviors and aspects of the learning environment are things that can be built into lots of different environments, including the home, right? Mm-hmm. So it can be helpful for parents in that way as well. I want to make sure we have some time for questions, so I'm going to try to wrap it up here. The second to last part of the report is just a visual representation of all 5 domain scores, and this is what's called a spider graph, which is a little bit of exotic data geekery that I brought to this process because I love data and I love graphs. But the way that this graph works is basically this is a like a pentagon, right, where 0 is at the very center, and then this very faint gray line that's very difficult to see is 100, and that represents the minimum score and the maximum possible score for each of these 5 domains, and then the dot shows what the score actually was. So the idea here is that you can see all 5 scores together at once. If all 5 scores are approximately in the same place, it will be a very regular pentagon. If your classroom was maybe very strong in domains 1, 2, and 3, but weak in domain 4, then this would look more irregular because this point would be much closer to the center. The last part of this report, which is something new that we just recently added in the most recent app update, is to facilitate the use of this data for coaching of teachers and continuous improvement. So this is a place where the observer can have a conversation with the guide about what's going really well in the classroom. What is the next step? What's the low-hanging fruit in terms of the next place where we can grow? And then setting some goals, between now and the next observation. What are the things that I want to work on? What are the changes I want to make in this environment? And really important to consider, what's the support that I need as the guide to meet those goals? Mm-hmm. Within the app, you also have the option to track for either school-wide or looking at a single classroom trends over time with domain scores. This graph looks all over the place because this is our practice school, so this is all fake data. A real classroom, we would not expect this kind of ping-ponging all over the place, but you can set a date range if you want to see, well, how did our classrooms grow between fall and spring of this year? This is a good visual representation for that. I don't know why I have 2 slides for this. Okay, so like I said, I want to be sure that I leave some time for questions. It looks like we have a few folks who are live here with us. Deneen, how would you like to facilitate the Q&A part?
Yeah, so if you are here live, absolutely just chime in on the chat. Let us know if you've got any questions. And while we're waiting for people to chime in, Kitty, I'm hoping you can tell, let's say, we've got people that are listening to this and they're like, this is such a great tool. I want this for my school. I see the benefits of it, both internally and for our community. What is the next step for them to get started?
Sure. So the next step to get started is to go through the training and certification process. We offer an online asynchronous training, which means that it's a training process that you can do online at any time of the day or night. It's not a live Zoom session like this. It's a series of online modules in our learning portal that you work through kind of at your own pace. And the goal of the training and certification process is not only to teach you how to use the tool, but also to be sure that you have a deep understanding of each individual item and how to score the individual items. So we're shooting for something called inter-rater reliability. And the idea is that at the end of that training and certification process, you're able to score a classroom the same way that we would. And that's how we know that everyone who's using the tool is speaking the same language and using the same numbers, right? So that process is available online at any time. And that is for folks who want to become certified to actually have a DERS account and conduct observations. What we've found is that just learning about the DERS tool is a really powerful professional development experience, even for folks who aren't going to be conducting observations. In many schools, the coach does the observations and then maybe discusses the observations with the teachers, but the teachers themselves don't actually need to be trained in how to use the app. So we also have just a DERS orientation available as an online course for folks who are going to be perhaps on the receiving end of DERS observations or working with the data and who need to understand what the data means, but who don't actually need to be trained on how to use the tool. And you can find information about both of those processes on the DERS website, which is ders-app.org. You can also reach out to me or the whole DERS team at those email addresses that are there on the slide.
Absolutely. We've got a question. How much does this tool cost?
Sure. So initial training and certification, that online training that I mentioned, is $355, and that includes a 1 year subscription to use the tool. At the end of that 1 year, there is a online refresher course that you take, and then it's $110 to renew your subscription for another year.
And so that is not only getting trained, but access, and you can use it as much as you want in that year, right?
Correct.
And then renewal again is $110 for the subscription, basically.
Yes, exactly. And that orientation course that I mentioned is $85 per person.
That's a deal. I mean, I imagine, like using this for even just a professional development tool for your guides, because I know there's a lot of reinventing the wheel and how to figure out how to really create an assessment situation where you can really give that positive feedback and areas for improvement. And the DERS has such a good structure for that to really build that conversation.
Yeah, what we found was that just the process of learning about the DERS, I mean, even though these are all things that we all kind of already know and in theory are already part of Montessori practice, just learning about the tools sensitized teachers to those things and gave them a lens for looking at and thinking about their own environments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it gave them the structure. Awesome. So if somebody was going to take a path of getting completely certified and having a subscription versus or an orientation, what does that look like from there? So let's say somebody does the orientation but still wants somebody to come in and do this process. So I guess this is two questions. Is there a way that they can reach a certain consultant or somebody that can do that? Do you guys have a list of people that do that?
Yeah, so we're in the process now of developing a higher level of training called rater training for folks who wanted to use this in a consulting capacity, or our hope is that eventually this will be a tool that folks can use as part of their, QRIS framework or their performance management framework, instead of some of those other measures that we discussed earlier on the call that are not really working so well for them in terms of showcasing what they're doing. And then for those sort of external high stakes evaluators, they would need that higher level of DERS training. So that's something that we have in the works. The DERS is a relatively new tool. The app was only released in January of 2016. So we're still kind of in the early adopter phase, but we've seen really an explosion of interest, especially in this last school year.
Yeah, I imagine. So that leads me to ask you, what has been the response in not just the Montessori community, but outside of the Montessori community? Are you turning heads yet? Because what I love about this tool is that it doesn't have to be in a Montessori environment. It is meant for a learning environment, and it just so happens that Montessori does really well. But have you been turning heads in the other areas in education?
Right. Yeah. There's a reason that it's called the developmental environmental rating scale and not the Montessori environmental rating scale, because again, all the literature that we drew from to build it, none of it has the word Montessori in it anywhere. This is all mainstream education literature, and there's nothing specific to Montessori about it. So we do believe that it's a tool that is of value to all developmentally oriented learning environments. We imagine that Waldorf, Reggio Emilia, those sort of other progressive pedagogies are probably those who would be most immediately interested. So it's one of our goals for the near future is to try and make inroads beyond the Montessori community. The reception that we've gotten from Montessori schools has been really, really awesome, and we do have, I think, about a 50-50 mix of public and independent Montessori schools that currently are DERS users, but we're really hoping to, make a splash sort of beyond the Montessori community in the near future.
Absolutely. We've got another question from Adrian. She wants to know how many schools are currently using the tool. Do you have those numbers?
Oh gosh, it's over 100. I don't remember exactly how many, but it's like 110-ish, and they are actually all over the world. They're not just in the United States. I think there are like 8 different countries where we have trained DERS users, and the fact that we've moved to an asynchronous training model really makes it easier for international folks to access it. We have over 500 trained DERS users.
Great. That's awesome. Great. So it looks like we don't have any more questions, and I don't want to take up any more of your time, Katie. I know you are a busy woman. So again, thank you for joining us in this and really, introducing so methodically through this whole process. I know you have been working on it. How many years did it take you to develop this?
So this is an initiative that has been a part of our work since the founding of the National Center. There were 4 years of research and development that went into the creation of the tool, and it's really Jackie Cosentino, our director of research. It's really her brainchild. She's really the force behind it that brought this to fruition.
Yeah, I love it. Well, we are so thankful for this. And please do keep us in the loop and see how things are going. And anything that we can do, as a marketing community for Montessori schools, let us know, because we definitely want to make sure that as a, partner in this Montessori movement and making sure that we're able to help parents access this amazing education system, partners like you are incredibly important in this process. So please keep us in the loop with what you're doing.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you guys today. And please don't hesitate to reach out if anyone wants to continue the conversation.
Absolutely. All right. Take care. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you.